Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to join our Learn and Share session for July. And this time round, we're going to be talking about end of grant reports, which is an important part of the grant making cycle. And it's a really important part for both us as funders and for organisations that have received funding as well. So end of grant reports or monitoring reports, why do they matter and why do we ask to see this kind of information? So it enables us to see the impact of your project, and you can then share that with your trustees, your committee, and also your wider publicity. So as part of our work, particularly as a community foundation, we are negotiating a journey between a philanthropic journey between our donors and our fund holders who want to give money to community organisations, and then also the community groups that are funded. And in order to support our work promoting philanthropy, a big part of that is to be able to demonstrate to our fund holders, to our donors, their fantastic work that the local voluntary community sector do. And in order to do that, we need to see that impact gathered in from organisations such as yourselves. Now, this information is obviously noted how it's beneficial for us as the funders, but how can it be useful for you as organisations beyond that reporting back to the fund holder? So it can be useful because you can then capture those stories, that information, perhaps case studies for individuals, to then put that on your own either social media or your own annual reports that you can then share with either existing donors or potentially new donors who you're trying to attract. You can also use this information when you're writing future funding applications. So, for example, you might have delivered a pilot project that was funded by Northamptonshire Community Foundation. And once that project has been completed and your pilot work has been tested, and you've been able to see the impact that that's had, if then you decide that you want to either apply again to the Community Foundation, or if you're looking to apply to perhaps a larger national funder like the National Lottery, for example, that information that you've captured and gathered, as I said, those case studies or stats and facts about how people have their lives have been improved by your project, you can then include that in your applications to those other grant makers. By taking the time to and to see what has worked well and what hasn't worked well, team to be able to think, okay, what can I do moving forward in the future? How can I, or how can we as an organisation was it that perhaps we needed to delve a bit further and a bit deeper into a particular issue that we were trying to tackle? There's often also unexpected changes, or there might be unexpected benefits that come out of your project. And the end of grant report is a perfect chance to be able to sit back and evaluate and monitor what's happened over the course to be able to move forward. Also, end of grant reports are often a key condition of grant awarding. So it's often in the terms and conditions of your grant agreement. It certainly is with us at Northamptonshire Community Foundation. but lots of other funders out there will have something along the lines of some form of impact monitoring. Sometimes it will be similar to us, where there is a formal online report that you need to complete. Others, it may be that they ask you to report back in your own terms. It could be through an annual impact report, for example, that you can put together and curate yourselves. But often there is going to be some kind of need to show how the funding you've received has made a positive difference. So you may be thinking, how can we look at and talk about impact and the positive difference that can be made in an individual's life or a community's life? What I'm sharing now on the screen is something called the theory of change. So this means that it's a very simple version that I'm showing to you now. There are much more complex versions out there which can go into some more detail, but this is a very good basic start. So as an organisation, when you're putting together an application to apply for funding, or even when you're thinking about what the purpose of your organisation is and why you exist in the community, you might be thinking, what are the issues that we're trying to tackle? And that could be a whole vast different array of things depending on what your organisation does. So it could be anything from looking to promote the access to arts and culture. It could be around sports, physical activity, and well-being. It could be around mental health, all sorts of different things that you might be looking to achieve and support. So the issues in your community might be that the reason your organisation exists is because you can see in your local community that, for example, there might be poor mental health, there might be poor physical health and well-being issues, there could be issues around poverty, there could be issues around social isolation, and you'll either be able to obviously see some of this evident in your community just from observation, talking to local community members, or you might be looking at the data and the stats and facts about your community that you live in. And when I say community, it could be a ward within your town, it could be a village, it could be a whole town, it could be the whole county. So it doesn't have to be limited. So, and also community can also be made up of people who are like-minded and are looking to do the same thing. So you might be working with people across a wide geographical area, but the focus is the same. And so that's what your community is made up of. So you've looked at the issues and you understand why your organisation exists. You understand what the needs are of your community, and then you'll probably have an understanding about what you want to tackle. So what is the impact that you want to have? So we often look at this as being the opposite of the issue. So as I mentioned, if you've been able to see that the issue in your community is poor mental health, then the impact that you want to have, the goal that you want to achieve, is improving mental health, improving well-being. If you see there's lots of social isolation, you want to reduce isolation or increase opportunities for social connection. So we're looking at things that are opposites, and we're often saying things like reduce or improve or increase. Those are the sort of words that you're thinking of when you're looking at that impact that you want to have. And then your service is what's going to get people from A to B. So the service that you're going to deliver is about how you can get people from those issues that they might be experiencing to the impact, those goals that you want to achieve to help improve their life. So this is a version of a theory of change, but broken down into a little bit more detail. So from this, we can see obviously the needs and the issues. So what are you going to focus on? What are you going to address? Then the next stage is what those inputs are. So that could be staff time, it could be volunteers, it could be equipment, it could be venue, training, whatever, all of the resources that you're putting into this. And these might be resources that you might already have had access to, or they might be resources that the grant funding has allowed you to access. So you have all your inputs, and then your outputs, otherwise known as your activities, are what are the services and activities that you've provided. So that could be, as I said, your different services like social activities. It could have been exhibitions that people could access. It could be counselling services, whatever that might be. And then the final column is about the outcomes and the impact. So what are the positive things, changes that you want to see? And some of those might be short term. So for example, if somebody is going along to let's say a lunch club, and as part of that, the short term support that they might be getting is they've got access to food, a nutritious meal is a short-term impact. They also are getting out of the house and connecting with people. Those are some examples of short-term impact. The medium-term impact is that over the course of, let's say, 3 to 6 months, how has that access to the lunch club helped improve them? So, for example, if they're an older person, it might have helped improve their mobility. It might improve their overall physical well-being and their mental well-being because they're building connections, they're making friends. And then the longer term impact are those sorts of impacts that you'll see over many years working with a beneficiary. And some of that you won't be able to necessarily report back to your funder straight away. Those are some things that you can hopefully tell the story of through your own impact reports that you put together in case studies over a longer period of time. So here is an example of this in these columns, but in a completed one for let's say the rural community transport as an example. So the needs and the issues that have been identified by an organisation are things like lack of public transport in rural areas, so it's harder for people to get around if they don't have their own car. They might be experiencing less access to arts and culture because there are, for example, less facilities and institutions in their rural village. They also might find it more difficult to access health services. And there's probably a whole host of other needs and issues that we could identify for somebody who might be living in a rural area, but they don't have access to their own transport, they don't have their own car. So what are the inputs for this rural community transport organisation? Well, it could be, for example, they've got volunteer drivers. It could be that they have some staff, which could be admin staff, or they might have paid drivers who work a particular route. They will probably also have their vehicles, which again, it could be volunteer drivers' vehicles, or it could be they have a minibus, for example. Other inputs that they'll need to put into the project are things like fuel and maintenance for those vehicles, DBS checks for volunteer drivers, training for staff and volunteers. These are just some examples of the kind of inputs that will have to be provided for this activity to take place. And then, of course, the activities, the outputs, are those regular trips and visits that the transport community, the transport organisation is able to deliver. So whether that is regular visits to supermarkets, organised social trips, it could be support accessing health appointments. Those are some examples of the types of activities. And then the outcomes from this are things like reduced isolation. So, for example, through those organised social trips or perhaps weekly trips to the supermarket relationships and friendships can build, either with volunteers or other people accessing the service. It could be things like improved physical and mental well-being, because not only are they able to access health appointments, but they might be able to be getting out more, particularly if it's an organised trip to a particular area that's helping to promote them hopefully moving more, improving mobility. And then also it could be things like increased access to services or the arts by having these organised social trips. They might be able to visit local museums, local art galleries, for example, as part of that enrichment of what a rural community transport organisation can provide. So looking at these activities, looking at these outcomes and impacts, what could we look at measuring and recording? So funders often want to know how you're going to collect the information to show that the project has been successful. So this could include things like, for example, keeping a track of the number of people who've taken part, so the number of trips that have taken place. It could be the number of people who've attended, so how many people go on your weekly trip to the supermarket or your social outings. You could ask your service users to complete a survey in which they can talk about and feedback how having access to the community transport service has helped them. It could be things around discussing the project with your committee and talking about how you can identify ways that can be improved. So, for example, you might look at you might get feedback from your service users and realise that you might need to invest some time and money perhaps in a specific vehicle that's going to allow wheelchair access, for example. So I'm just going to whiz through, and here are some of the ways that you could record that. Now, some of this, the information that I've got up on there at the moment are things that are looking at quantitative figures. So these are the number aspect of the work. So the number of trips, the number of hours, the number of volunteers involved. This is where you can get those quantifiable numbers. But there are other also more soft data that you can gather, and that's through asking for feedback. That's by asking for people to provide information about if they feel that their well-being has been improved, or they feel that they've been able to perhaps have their health improved by being able to access services. That's sort of more of the qualitative data, where you might get feedback, either written feedback or verbal feedback, if you carry out some interviews or some calls with some of your service users. So that's a little bit about measuring impact and what we mean by impact and outcomes. And when you're completing a grant application, you're able to sort of select which areas that you think that you are going to be able to feedback on. So, for example, if you feel that with your project you're going to improve mental health and well-being, you can select that as part of your application, and then you know that that's what we're going to be hoping you to feedback on, is about that mental health and well-being, and so on and so forth, with different outcomes that you might select. So we'll go through in this section a bit more about end of grant reports in a bit more detail. So I'm actually going to stop sharing that, and I'm just going to quickly share with you what a grant application, what an end of grant report looks like. So if you just bear with me again. So hopefully you can see this is an end of grant report. I'm not going to scroll up because then you'll see the details of the organisation. But as part of an online end of grant report, at the top part of it, you will see information about what you were funded for, so how much you were funded, which funding programme it was for, the description of the project, just as a reminder about what you were funding for and therefore what we're asking for feedback on. Once you have that sort of refresher information at the top, when you scroll down, you'll see this section, which is about how the grant was spent. So here you can see a budget that has been outlined in an application. For the different sections, we can see obviously they've talked about staff costs, volunteer costs, operational costs, office costs. There are some subheadings that aren't included, like publicity and capital costs, because they weren't requesting any funding to support those areas, but you might see them in your versions if you've applied for funding. Then what happens is under here, we will ask for information about so this is your proposed budget that we approved. And then underneath is your opportunity to say if it worked out that way. So you would select one of the subheadings, so staff, volunteer costs, for example. So you might click staff. And in this item description, you would put down what the description of that cost. So for in terms of like staff costs, you might say, well, this project, it was 100 hours of staff time at X amount per hour. We said it was going to cost, let's say, £1,200, and it might have ended up working out the same. It might have been your actual amount would have been £1,200. So if we just put this in here, so what you'll see is some figures pop up here, and that is essentially, this figure here is the total of budgeted amount, and this one is the total of actual amount. And for example, if I add an item, I put volunteer, and let's just put in, for example, volunteer training courses, first aid course. And let's say originally I thought it was going to cost £45, but in actual fact, it ended up costing, let's say, £35. You'll see here, these figures change. So this is keeping a little running tally for you. So hopefully it should help with the maths part of it. But what we will want to see is the budgeted amount should still be the total budgeted amount that you put forward. So it should still add up to £2,000. And in terms of actual amount spent, it should still be £2,000. Now you might have changed, £10 here and another £10 there. If you're, which is fine. However, if there were perhaps some bigger changes that you had to make during your grant project, your funded project, you should have come back to NCF, you should come back to the grants team beforehand to highlight if there were going to be any major changes to your budget, and got that in written, got some written permission and that to be approved. Wow. If it's the odd 10, 20, £30 here or there difference, and you are able to give us some legitimate reasons why you needed to make that should be okay. But if we're talking larger amounts that you are having to make changes for, it's always best to check in with your funder first, then to leave it to the end of grant report and say, well, actually, I did say I was going to spend £800 on staff costs, but instead I decided to buy 3 laptops instead. That's not going to make your funder very happy. So it's always good to sort of check in with them. So I'll just get rid of these. So the actual organisation who are doing this don't get a surprise. It says I can't remove the remaining item. How very rude of it. I'll show it to you, boss. There we go. So that's how it works in terms of the the budgeting. So you would put in how you have been spent. If you hadn't fully spent the grant, this is where you tick yes or no. If you put no, it's going to give you a prompt to get in contact with us so we can talk about how much is left of your grant. So if you have a fairly substantial amount left of your grant funding, this is where you probably need to contact us and say, can I have an extension, or can we talk about perhaps returning some of the grant if it hasn't been spent? So if you have more than a couple of £100 left of your grant, this is where we're going to want to have a conversation with you about either extending the life of the project so you can spend it down, or if funds need to be returned. Then in this section, we talk about what activities did you carry out with the funding. So this is similar to when you're writing an application, but almost in reverse. So this is where you get to describe to us what you were able to carry out, what services you provided, what activities you provided. It's an opportunity to talk about, for example, how many people were involved. You can go into a bit of detail, for example, if you were delivering a workshop, what type of activities were carried out in the workshop. You get to describe to us and essentially feedback how those funds were spent and what you were able to deliver with that. It has to be more than a couple of sentences. If you're just putting one sentence, we spent the money on counselling services, or we spent the money on a lawnmower, it's not enough. Particularly when you're looking at those larger amounts of grant funding, you have to provide some more detail about what you were able to purchase, what you were able to deliver through this funding. Then we have some questions about how many volunteers were involved, how many people benefited from the work, the area that they came from. Then as part of your application, we would have asked questions about the sort of the demographics of the people that you're working with, the sort of issues that you're looking to tackle. And so these are drop-down questions where you can just click on what's going to be most relevant to you. You'll get a reminder here of what you put in your original application. If things change slightly, that's okay. That's okay to sort of feedback and say that, for example, your primary might have been to focus on poverty and disadvantage, but actually it ended up more focused on the homeless prevention than it did poverty and disadvantage. And so on and so forth down here, where we've got activities and then information about demographic information about your beneficiaries that you've been able to support. And then we get to this section called impact and outcomes. And here, this is where we're going to be starting that journey about capturing that quantifiable impact of your project. So you can tell us, for example, this project was focusing on increased digital inclusion. And in this section, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different indicators that this group could have measured against. But they might not have measured all of them. So for example, out of this, they might have said, well, the number of people who reported increased knowledge and skills through accessing digital support, they might know the numbers of this. They might say, okay, well, through this project, we were able to work with 20 people, and of those 20 people, 18 of them said that they had increased skill and knowledge because they might have filled out a survey. So again, they can put in the figures here about 18 people, and then in this section, they can talk about, we carried out a survey, and of the 20 people who took part, 18 of them said that they felt their skills had increased. And this is how you sort of go on throughout this. Now, where there's a section where you're like, well, actually, that doesn't really relate to what our project did. So, for example, the number of people with improved online access, your project might not have had anything to do with people being able to access things online at home, for example. They might have only been able to do that in your community centre, for example. You may not have captured that information, and that's okay to leave it out. But ideally, you should be filling in at least one or two from each of the outcomes. And so this one obviously then goes on to look at homelessness. It then, with the final one, it talks about increased access to services. So these are the numbers where you can say the number of people who had their lives improved in some way or another. Then we get on to the more qualitative questions. So here we're looking at things like more of a description about the difference that's being made to the lives of your beneficiaries and the service users. So this is where you can go into some more detail, and I would probably say at least one or two paragraphs, if not more, about how your project has made a positive difference. So you can talk about the positive difference it's made to the beneficiaries and the wider community, which can include obviously not only about how the project directly supported them, but perhaps indirectly has supported them as well. So if this particular project, they're talking about digital access and digital skills. So that might include obviously being able to use a laptop, being able to use perhaps a tablet or a mobile phone. So using their actual devices, but what has that enabled them to do beyond that? So because they've been able to use a laptop, have they been able to then create CVs? Have they been able to apply for jobs? Or have they been able to access courses because you've given them these skills? So it's thinking about the direct support that this project might have helped with, but how has that then had a positive ripple effect? We then have some questions about challenges that your organisation, your project might have faced and how you've resolved them, which is a really good learning point for your organisation. And we know that sometimes organisations face challenges such as staff changes, it could be changes with volunteers, it could be things around accessing partnerships and support from other organisations that may have worked or not have worked, as the case may be. So there's always going to be, I imagine, some learning points. It could be about the fact that whether or not as many beneficiaries took part as you hoped. We then move on to these unintended or unexpected changes, with a positive or negative. And this might be where you talk about, for example, you may have planned for 20 people to attend, but actually 30 people said that they were interested. That could be an unexpected challenge or positive, depending on how your organisation was able to deal with it. It could be that you got some unexpected publicity for your organisation through the project. Those are just some different examples of what we mean by unintended or unexpected positive or negative changes to the project. Then we have a question looking at how your project might continue. So it might have been a one-off project, or it might be something that you're doing some continued work on. And then here we will ask about a story of change, which is where we ask for a case study. So this one is an example of somebody whose life has been improved by the project. Ideally, it's a service user, but it could be a volunteer who's been really positively impacted by the work. It may be that, for example, if you were doing a festival, so a one-off event, you may not have a particular story of change of somebody who attended as a member of the public, but it could be, as I mentioned, a volunteer, or it could be a series of feedback that you've been given about your event that you can collate and put into this section about the feedback of your work. We then also have a question about media coverage or publicity that you're happy to share that you may have had through your project. And then finally, we have, well, not quite finally, we've got the comments section where you can obviously talk about and give us feedback about how you found the funding process. And then What is final is where we're looking at the supporting documents. And obviously in your application, supporting documents means things like your reference, your bank statement, your annual accounts. But when we're looking at the end of grant report, what we mean by this is your evidence of spend. So throughout your project, you should be keeping a track of all of your evidence of spend. This is receipts, invoices. For example, if you're tracking things around staff costs, so how much staff time has been allocated to this particular project, and is that being tracked? This information you should be, if you have, for example, a paid member of staff who's working on finance, they should be tracking this. If you don't, and you're a volunteer organisation, perhaps, and you don't have this set up, you should be able to create your own spreadsheet fairly easily on something like Excel, where you can keep a track of how much is being spent. So how much is being spent on volunteer expenses, and have you got receipts for that? Have you got your receipts for anything that you've purchased? If you've got invoices, if you've had to hire a space, all of that information you need to collate. You might obviously have a laptop that you can have that information on. If not, there are lots of things like a Google Drive, so online clouds, where you can make sure that this information is saved and is secure. And so that when you come to do your end of grant report, it's there for you to access. But even beyond an end of grant report, this information is really important for your annual accounts, to whether that's something that you have looked at by an accountant, or if it's done within your own committee. But you have to have that information to show how you're spending the money. So that's where we would want to see this information attached. But also other things that you can attach could be things like photos of your project. It could be additional case studies. Anything that you want to share. It could be videos, for example, of the work. You can add this obviously onto the online end of grant report, but if for whatever reason you have any issues attaching things, you can either email them into us or send them in via post. I would say having digital copies is really useful, because you can send those quite quickly and hopefully keep track of them quite easily when you're properly saving things on a cloud, like Google Drive, for example. So that's a look at what the sort of the end of grant report looks like online for us. Obviously, it will be different for different funders. So if we just stop sharing there, and I'll go back to the PowerPoint. Skip through. So we've talked about explaining about what activities you've carried out. We've talked about a section where we asked about the difference that it's made to your beneficiaries and your service users. We've talked about unexpected or additional benefits or challenges your organisation have faced. We've talked about a case study as part of your project, of your end of grant report. We've talked about the outcomes. So that's where you're having those numbers of people, or number of hours, or number of volunteers involved. Then we're looking at information about your beneficiaries. So, for example, who is this project been able to support? We've talked about grant expenditure and evidence of spend. We've also talked about the feedback section, where you can provide information to us about how you found the grants process with NCF. And then you can also then declare whether or not you are happy for us to use your particular project for as like a case study for our own publicity uses. So here are some common mistakes that we see in end of grant reports. So submitting an end of grant before the project has been finished. So this is something I touched upon earlier, where I mentioned that, for example, you haven't fully spent your grant, you've still got money left over to spend, or your project might have perhaps faced some delays, and you therefore, when your end of grant report is due, your project might not have been completed. What we would say is, don't just go ahead and fill in the end of grant report. If you get to a stage where you think, actually, we've had some delays, or we haven't spent, things haven't cost as much as we thought, and therefore we've got some money left over, reach out to the grants team. Don't just go ahead and fill in the online report, because what will happen is that we'll contact you. We'll likely have to open up the end of grant report again, and then whether it's a few weeks or a few months down the line, you're going to have to complete it all over again. So please reach out and get in touch. Unapproved changes in your budget. Again, I sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but if you are having to change the delivery of your project, or the budget has had to change, and if it's, as I mentioned earlier, if it's a few, £10 here, £20 there, we understand that things are slightly different. However, if, as I gave the example before, you said that you were going to spend £800 on staff costs, and then instead you bought 3 laptops, that's a very different way of spending your budget that wasn't approved. And so therefore we're going to ask you a lot of questions about that. So again, reach out to our grants team before that happens so that we can discuss it. And it may be 9 times out of 10, I would say, we do approve changes to projects, but we aren't very happy if things have happened and changed and you haven't told us about it in advance, because it's a bit of a shock to us when we open up the end of grant report. One sentence answers. What we mean by this is, again, something I touched on a bit earlier. If you've been awarded a £5,000 grant to deliver a project over 6 months to a year, one sentence answers about what you've been able to achieve, or what you've been able to deliver, and the benefit that it's had on your community. One sentence is not really going to cut the mustard in terms of being able to see that it was a worthwhile project, and why perhaps we should consider funding it again. Now, by this, I'm not saying make things up, but if you've been delivering a project for 3 months, 6 months, a year, you should have enough knowledge and evidence about what's happened during that project to give us a full, clear description of what's happened. Having no case study. Again, this is another thing that we often see with end of grant reports, where they don't provide a case study. As I've mentioned, case studies can look different. Sometimes it will be a story of change for an individual or service user who's been really impacted by your project, and they may have come from a very difficult place in their life to having a much more positive experience, which is fantastic. But other times it might be about a story of change of a volunteer. It could be lots of little bits of feedback that your community have given back to you because you put on, let's say, a music event, and you aren't necessarily going to have an individual case study for that, but you might have lots of feedback that you've got from either surveys or social media that you can put together to show the difference that's been made. Missing evidence of spend, or no evidence of spend, is another big thing that we come across. As part of our work as a community foundation, we like to instill what for us is best practice for groups and organisations, is keeping a financial track of your spend, because we think that that's important, not only for you to report back to us as a funder, but to know that you are keeping track of your finances and have financial systems and controls in place for good governance for your organisation. And evidence of spend is a way to be able to demonstrate that. And of course, a big one is just missing the end of grant report deadline. As always, communication is a key thing of what I'm hopefully going to be getting across to you, is that if you're having any issues or problems with your project delivery, with your grant spend, please reach out to us so that we can help you through this, that we can talk about how we can help get you back on track, rather than not communicating with us and then either completing an end of grant report which shows that lots of things have been changed without discussing with us, firstly, or not communicating with us at all. So what makes a strong end of grant report? Again, in some ways, this is a bit of the opposites of the common mistakes. So making sure that you really highlight the benefits of the project, what you've been able to deliver, the activities that you've been able to provide, and how that's really supported your community that you're working with, and how that they've got something out of it. Making sure that you have that evidence of impact, so you have taken the time throughout your project to track those numbers, track the number of service users, track the number of sessions delivered. You've asked for surveys to be completed. Your volunteers and your staff have gathered together testimonies and case studies, because they all come together to paint a really clear picture about why your project and why your organisation is making a big difference in the community and therefore needs to continue. Lessons learned is a really useful thing for us to see, because we know that things don't always go to plan. And so having some lessons learned is something that really demonstrates that and shows that, for example, there might be things that you might want to change in the future to improve your project, to improve your service for the community. And photos, we love photos and videos. It's great to see. Obviously, we understand that there are some types of projects, for example, counselling, where we're not expecting you to take a snap of your service users. But where possible, photos are really able to paint a picture of what your project's been able to do. So here's some examples of some lovely photos that groups have sent over to us through the years. Making sure that they're high quality photos, so you haven't got someone's thumb in the image, or it's in, making sure that it's in focus, it's a clear photo. Those are some, obviously up here, we've got some lovely examples of photographs that groups have sent in. And we also really like to see things if you put it on social media, if you tag us, we love that as well. So these are all things that we like to see as part of the end of grant report. And for example, with Baby Basics, this is a good example of a group who they don't have photos of their service users, often because they're working with midwives, they're not working in healthcare professionals, so they're not working directly with parents who are in need of the baskets, but they send us photos of their staff team, of their volunteers. We also really love those. So we know that if, for example, it's not possible to take photos of the service users and beneficiaries, we still love to see you, we still love to see your staff team and volunteers. So things to remember: your annual report and accounts should also clearly show where the funding has come from, and it should be treated as restricted income. Your end of grant reports are due 30 days after the completion of your project. So we always give you a month to be able to. We always give you a month after the project date ends to complete the end of grant report, because we know that sometimes it will take you some time to compile all this information. If your project is delayed, as I've been trying to stress, make sure that you're communicating with us. And also, if your Budget changes, again, make sure that you're communicating with us, and make sure that you're sticking in line with the application and the terms and conditions of the grant or offer. But if you contact us in advance, we do try to be as flexible as possible. So here next, I'm just going to show you some examples of how we use the impact that you send in to us to then share that with our wider community of donors and supporters, and how we try to shine a spotlight on the amazing work that you do as community organisations, and try and emphasise about why it's so important for local philanthropy to exist. So we have our annual impact reports. Here's some examples of how we like to show this information. And you might decide that you want to create your own impact reports to be able to, again, show the vital work that you've been carrying out. So in the past, some of our impact reports have included things like those stats, so those quantifiable information. So here we've got information about obviously the number of people who've been able to access support services, or the number of people who've been able to access food aid support, for example. Then we also include a case study of the groups that we have funded, just like you might include a case study of a beneficiary that you've supported. All of that can be anonymised as well, so you don't have to necessarily put a name or a face into a case study. It can all be anonymised. We then also create infographics as well, which we share on social media. With our impact reports, they're often published into hard copies as well as on our website. But sometimes we use infographics on social media as another way of being able to talk about the highlights of what we've been able to achieve with community organisations each year. And those are also some things that you can use to promote what you've been able to achieve throughout the year. So here is our contact information if you need to reach out to us to talk about anything to do with any projects that might be funded at the moment, or if you've got some questions about funding in the future. So I'm just going to stop sharing there. And then also I'm going to stop recording.